Prince Philip gave up his name, his nationality, his career, his faith, his independence. He renounced his Greek and Danish royal titles, became a naturalized British citizen, converted from Greek Orthodoxy to Anglicanism, and adopted the surname Mountbatten from his mother's side, because his own family name carried the stench of foreign exile. And then, on the 6th of February 1952, when Elizabeth became queen and he was 30 years old, with a genuine shot at reaching the Admiralty on his own merit, he walked away from the Royal Navy forever. No constitutional role awaited him, no defined authority, no formal position beyond the word consort, which sounds grand until you realize it means you walk 2 paces behind your wife for the rest of your life. He did all of this because he loved her. And there was someone inside Buckingham Palace who made absolutely certain he would never be permitted to forget that it still wasn't enough. Not the Queen. Her mother, Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon, the Queen Mother, is one of the most carefully constructed public images in British history. The nation's grandmother, gin and Dubonnet on the terrace, waving from balconies at the age of 97 with that particular tilt of the head, that rehearsed warmth, that smile that suggested she had never harbored a cruel thought in her 101 years on this earth. And that image is not entirely fiction. She was genuinely brave during the Blitz. She did stay in London when the bombs fell. She did visit the rubble of the East End and say she was glad Buckingham Palace had been hit, because now she could look the people in the face. But behind the hats and the smiles and the decades of curated benevolence was something much harder, something colder. And the person who bore the worst of it was the man her daughter loved. So why did she hate him? Start with who she was. Born the 4th of August, 1900, into one of the oldest families in the British aristocracy. Her father, Claude Bowes-Lyon, was the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn. The family seat was Glamis Castle in Angus, a place so steeped in Scottish history that Shakespeare set Macbeth there. The Bowes-Lyons weren't new money or foreign imports. They had been in Scotland since the 14th century. Their status was the kind that never needed to be stated, because it simply was. When she married Prince Albert, the Duke of York, in 1923, she considered herself to be stepping up in title, but certainly not in class. The royal family, after all, had German blood and a surname, Windsor, that had been hastily invented during the First World War to disguise the fact that they'd been called Saxe-Coburg-Gotha until that became inconvenient. This background produced a very specific kind of person. Quiet confidence, absolute certainty about who belonged and who didn't, and an instinctive, almost cellular suspicion of anyone she considered beneath the standard her world demanded. Now look at Philip through her eyes. Technically a prince, but a prince of what, exactly? The Greek royal house had been deposed. His family had scattered across Europe like shrapnel. His father, Prince Andrew of Greece, died in Monte Carlo in reduced circumstances. His mother, Princess Alice, a remarkable woman genuinely, had suffered severe mental health crises and spent years in sanatoria. Philip had been educated at Gordonston, Kurt Hahn's Spartan school in the north of Scotland, which the British establishment considered eccentric at best. He had no money, no landed wealth, no great English estate, no deep roots in any soil the Queen Mother recognized as legitimate. And then there was the uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten, whose ambitions for his family's influence within the British monarchy were barely concealed, and whom the establishment distrusted as an empire builder operating under the guise of royal service. Philip wasn't just marrying in. In the Queen Mother's calculus, he was a Trojan horse. But here's the thing. She had ammunition that went far beyond snobbery. And this is where the story gets genuinely complicated, because the ammunition was real. Philip had 3 surviving sisters. Margarita had married Gottfried, Prince of Hohenlohe-Langenburg. Theodora had married Berthold, Margrave of Baden. Sophie had married Prince Christoph of Hesse. His 4th sister, Cecilia, had died in a 1937 air crash along with her husband. All 4 marriages were into the German aristocracy, and some carried undeniable Nazi associations. Sophie's husband, Prince Christoph of Hesse, had been a member of the Nazi Party and served in the SS, not in some nominal look-the-other-way capacity, but as director of the Forschungsamt, Hermann Göring's intelligence-gathering operation. Margarita's husband, Gottfried, held Nazi Party membership. So did Theodora's husband, Berthold. Photographs existed of Philip's relatives at events featuring Nazi insignia. These weren't invented smears. They were facts. And the Queen Mother, the woman who'd stood on that balcony as the Luftwaffe tried to level London, had earned a moral authority on the subject of the war that was essentially beyond challenge. She and George VI had become the living symbols of British resistance. So when she looked at Philip, she didn't just see a penniless foreign prince with bad table connections. She saw a man whose own sisters had married into the machinery of the enemy. Multiple biographers, including Giles Brandreth and Sarah Bradford, report that the Queen Mother and members of her circle used the term the Hun to describe Philip's family. 2 syllables that compressed every anti-German sentiment of the century into a casual dismissal. Now, and this matters, Philip himself had served with distinction in the Royal Navy during the war. He'd been mentioned in dispatches at the Battle of Cape Matapan in 1941. He was present in Tokyo Bay for the Japanese surrender in 1945. He fought against the Nazis at considerable personal risk, while his fiancée sheltered in Windsor Castle. To hold his sister's marriages against him, marriages over which he had no control, marriages that predated the conflict, wasn't reasonable caution. Not when it lasted decades. It was the exploitation of a wound that could never be fully answered, because Philip couldn't undo his sister's choices any more than he could undo his own birth. And that was precisely its power. The Queen Mother didn't need to make explicit accusations. She just needed the associations to linger. She set herself against the match from the start. Sarah Bradford, in her 1996 biography, Elizabeth, describes how the Queen Mother expressed reservations rooted not in any personal failing of Philip's character, but in what he represented. Robert Lacey in Monarch and Ben Pimlott in The Queen both note that the Queen Mother would have preferred Elizabeth to marry a man from the British aristocracy. Names like Hugh Euston, who later became the Duke of Grafton, were floated as supposedly more suitable candidates. Not just socially suitable, strategically suitable. A British aristocrat would know his place. Philip, everyone already knew, did not. King George VI deferred to his wife's concerns enough that the engagement was delayed. It wasn't officially announced until the 9th of July 1947, well after it might have been. The Queen Mother couldn't stop the marriage, but she could make the hesitation visible. The wedding itself, on the 20th of November 1947 at Westminster Abbey, was a grand national event. But look at the guest list, and you'll find a pointed absence. None of Philip's 3 surviving German sisters were invited. Not Margarita, not Theodora, not Sophie. None of his German relations received invitations. The official justification was that anti-German sentiment made their presence inappropriate. And yes, only 2 years had passed since the war ended. But Philip's mother, Princess Alice, was there. Just not his sisters, not his family. He stood at the altar largely alone, while the Windsors and Bowes-Lyons filled every pew. And that was only the beginning. The real blow came 5 years later. This is the centerpiece, the single most concrete, provable, viscerally understandable act of marginalization in the entire decades-long campaign. When George VI died in February 1952 and Elizabeth became queen, a question of enormous symbolic weight arose. What would the royal house be called? Custom held that when a queen regnant married, the house took her husband's family name. That's exactly what happened when Victoria married Albert. The House of Hanover gave way to the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. By this logic, the House of Windsor should now become the House of Mountbatten. Lord Mountbatten, characteristically unsubtle, reportedly boasted at a dinner party that the House of Mountbatten now reigned. That remark reached the ears of the elderly Queen Mary, Elizabeth's grandmother, who was appalled. She alerted Jock Colville, the Queen's private secretary. Within days, the machinery of opposition had mobilized. Winston Churchill, in his second term as Prime Minister, was adamantly against any change. Lord Salisbury, the powerful Conservative peer who embodied the old political establishment, was equally opposed. And the Queen Mother, widowed barely days, raw with grief, carrying the moral weight of a woman who had just buried a king, threw everything she had behind keeping the Windsor name. Churchill, Queen Mary, the courtiers, the Queen Mother, all of them united against one man. On the 9th of April, 1952, barely 2 months after her accession, the 25-year-old Queen issued a declaration in council. The royal house would remain the House of Windsor. Philip was devastated. Brandreth, drawing on years of personal friendship with the Duke, records 2 quotes that have become legendary in royal biography. The first, "I am the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his children." The second, rawer, more bitter, more revealing, "I am nothing but a bloody amoeba." An amoeba, an organism that reproduces without contributing its own genetic identity. That's how the man who'd given up everything described what they'd reduced him to. What makes the Queen Mother's role particularly damaging is that she wasn't just one voice among many. She was the voice that mattered most to the only person who could have decided differently. Elizabeth adored her mother. The Queen Mother's grief gave her an almost unassailable moral authority in those early months of the new reign. When she counseled her daughter that the Windsor name must be preserved, she wasn't offering an opinion. She was wielding the emotional leverage of widowhood at the precise moment her daughter was least able to resist it. Philip, by several accounts, including Bradford's, blamed his mother-in-law more than Churchill, because you can argue with a prime minister, but you cannot argue with a grieving mother. 8 years later, on the 8th of February 1960, a partial compromise emerged. Elizabeth issued an order in council declaring that descendants not entitled to the style of Royal Highness would bear the surname Mountbatten-Windsor. A concession, but deliberately limited. In practice, the core royal family would continue to be Windsors in every way that mattered. Even this modest accommodation was reportedly resisted by the Queen Mother, who saw any insertion of the Mountbatten name as capitulation. Brandreth and Lacey both note it came only because Philip lobbied privately and relentlessly, and because the Queen recognized she had inflicted a genuine injustice on her husband. It came grudgingly. It came 8 years late, and the Queen Mother made sure everyone knew she disapproved. But the naming crisis, devastating as it was only the most visible front in a much wider war. The daily marginalization was carried out through a subtler mechanism, the palace courtiers who surrounded the Queen and who took their cultural cues from the generation that preceded them. Chief among them, Sir Alan Tommy Lascelles, private secretary to the sovereign from 1943 to 1953. Lascelles was the embodiment of the old guard, deeply conservative, rigidly devoted to precedent, and profoundly suspicious of anyone who threatened the existing order. His diaries, published posthumously in 2006 as King's Counselor, reveal a man whose attitude toward Philip ranged from cool to openly dismissive. Lascelles and the Queen Mother were natural allies. Both had served George VI. Both believed in a monarchy rooted in tradition and restraint. Both viewed Mountbatten influence as a contagion. When Philip, in the early years of Elizabeth's reign, attempted to modernize Buckingham Palace, rationalizing staffing, introducing efficient procedures, bringing his naval commander's instinct for organization to a household still running on Edwardian principles, he hit a wall. Pimlott describes how courtiers effectively froze Philip out, limiting his involvement in official business and denying him access to the red dispatch boxes containing state papers. Philip had no constitutional right to see those documents. That much is true. But George VI had routinely shared them with the Queen Mother when she was his consort. She had wielded enormous influence during his reign, been central to political decisions, helped manage the fallout of the 1936 abdication crisis, shaped the very institution her daughter now led. She had enjoyed precisely the kind of partnership with her husband that Philip was denied with his wife, and she saw no contradiction in this whatsoever. That double standard is staggering when you hold it up to the light. The Queen Mother had been an active, influential, politically engaged consort. She had shaped policy, offered counsel, stood at the center of power. But when her son-in-law sought even a fraction of that same partnership, the doors were closed. Not because the precedent didn't exist. It did. She'd said it. But because the precedent was for her and not for him. This is what elevates the story beyond a personality clash. This was institutional. The Queen Mother didn't just dislike Philip privately. She operated through a network. The courtiers who blocked him weren't acting in a vacuum. They were products of a culture she had helped create and continued to sustain through her immense influence within the palace. She didn't need to issue direct orders. She set the temperature of the room, and everyone dressed accordingly. Year after year, decade after decade. From the 1947 engagement through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. Through the turmoil of Diana and Charles in the 80s and 90s. Through the Queen's annus horribilis in 1992. Through all of it, the Queen Mother maintained her position, her influence, and her quiet, implacable opposition to Philip's full acceptance. She lived until the 30th of March, 2002, 101 years old. And the Cold War between her and Philip lasted from the day Elizabeth brought him home until the day the Queen Mother died. 55 years. That's not a disagreement. That's a siege. And Elizabeth was caught in the middle of it. Every year. Every Christmas at Sandringham, every state occasion, every family decision, pulled between the mother she adored and the husband who had surrendered everything to be beside her. That's the part nobody talks about. The cost wasn't just Philip's, it was hers. Which brings us to the quote, the one that, if you believe the biographers who've reported it, cracks the whole story open. Philip, a man famous for his discipline, his stiff upper lip, his refusal to complain publicly about anything, is reported to have said in private that the Queen Mother was the person who caused his wife the most pain. Not him, his wife. He didn't frame it as his own grievance. He framed it as what it did to Elizabeth, being trapped between two people who would never make peace, carrying the weight of a conflict she didn't start and couldn't resolve. That's not bitterness. That's something much sadder. That's a man who watched the woman he loved suffer for decades and knew exactly who was responsible. He gave up his name, his country, his career, his faith, his independence. He walked 2 steps behind his wife for 69 years without public complaint. He endured the courtiers, the snubs, the bloody amoeba of it all. And the Queen Mother made sure he never walked beside her. Not once. Subscribe for more stories like this.